Welcome to Live and Unscripted with Susan Smith, quilting's first reality show.
Hello and welcome. I'm Susan Smith. Welcome into my studio, Stitched by Susan. This is a live streaming episode if you are watching it in real time. This is streamed as I'm doing the project, so everything is in legitimate, actual time, all the hiccups included. That's what Live and Unscripted is all about. So, our project today is going to be a vintage pieced quilt and 108-inch wide backing. So those are kind of two topics that we're going to focus on a little bit today. So if those are of interest to you, stay tuned. I'm going to have some great tips for you for dealing with both of those types of projects. So I'm very happy to see you all here this morning. We do an earlier kind of casual intro, and I had a chance to greet lots of people and see where folks are viewing from. It's so exciting to see people from all over the world tuning in. That is so fabulous. So I've got my cup of coffee in hand. But before we get started quilting, there's just a few credits that I want to give, a few thank yous, and then we'll launch into the project. So first and foremost is always my husband, Dave. We call him Mr. Producer. He's behind the scenes, operating cameras. Hang on a second. There we go. Well, you see what I'm saying? We have to check out the cameras before we go live. We try to see that it's seamless, but it does not always work that way. That's the beauty of quilting live. And by the way, I do have show t-shirts. If anybody's interested, we can give you a link to my Etsy shop. But on the front, they're pretty ordinary. They're just my Stitched by Susan logo. But on the back, they say, Live and Unscripted, where anything can happen and likely will. And thanks to Eva, who's watching today, for coming up with that tagline, because that is just the truth of these episodes. Anything can happen, and it very, very often does. So a few more thank yous, though. Our son, Will, who does the various intro voices for us today. It was kind of Australian, some kookaburras in the background. Pretty fun that way. And also our good friend, Dan, who lets us use his beautiful guitar music that you'll hear throughout the episode. So thanks to all those people for their help and contributions. And also thanks to many of you who support this show. YouTube, of course, is free to watch. You just have to pay in ads. But there is also a way that you can support the show if you wish to. You can do that simply by going to buymeacoffee.com /Stitched by Susan. And that's a place where you can contribute as little as $5 one time, or if you wish, you can commit to a monthly subscription. And all of the funds that come in that way, we pour right back into improving our lighting and sound equipment. And if you want to know what your dollars have achieved, go back and look at a couple episodes from 2 or 3 years ago, and you'll see a really big difference. We've grown up. And 2 or 3 years hence, we may look back again and say, what were we thinking? But we're learning. So it is our pleasure to bring these episodes to you. Okay, have I covered the early bases? I think I have. We're going to start into our project. And of course, as always, I'll be chatting throughout. So I'll be telling you about some more things that are on the horizon, talking to you about some of the products that I'm using, and of course, talking about the various challenges or decisions that present themselves as I work on this quilt and how I kind of process through them. So grab your cup of whatever you're drinking today and let's get started. All right. So our quilt top today is a vintage piece one, and I don't have the quilt here yet. We're going to talk about the backing first, and this is a biggish point of interest. If you've ever quilted with 108-inch wide backing, you've probably already found this out. That fabric, because it's so huge and it's folded in half and in half again before it's wound on the bolt, very often, pretty much always, is very distorted. The grain is pulled very crooked. Sometimes in the length of a quilt, it will be 8 or 10 inches of twist. How does a quilter deal with that? Well, I want to give you some tips today, but I also want to say, I don't know that it's a thing that you can do perfectly. I don't have precise measurements for you, so please don't ask me for precision, but I'll tell you some of the ways that I try to manage it. On some of the backings that are super badly twisted, you might just have to settle for better but not precise. That's just the reality of it. But today, fortunately, the backing is not too awful. It's this very simple muslin, again, 108 inches wide. And so what we've done, this is a multi-level project today. What we've done is the quilt top that I'll be quilting for my client Marla. She actually had a very huge quilt, and she decided to cut it in half and make 2 quilts, one for her and one for her sister. So now we've got these 2 quilts that are the same length and not terribly wide. So we kind of thought this through beforehand and decided if we get this 108-inch wide backing, we can load the backing once and load the 2 quilts one right after another. However, we want the quilts to be a little bit different, so I'll talk a bit later about thread and quilting design choices. They will not be identical, but they will have the same backing. So with that in mind, we measured the quilts and determined how much backing we needed and which way we might load it, and we thought that through in advance. I like loading with the selvage edge along my rails because I know that's a straight edge, and particularly when I'm using this often wonky wide backing. That can be helpful to getting it straight. So knowing that, then we've got 108 inches from the selvage on this side to the selvage on the far side. So then what we needed to think through was, do our quilts go this way? That would be difficult to quilt. So no, they're going to go horizontally. And they're a bit long and a bit narrow. So we've just measured that out to know that we've got enough length of our backing to be long enough for the quilt. And we have 108 inches this way. Does that all make sense? Chime in if you have questions about this. I'll do my best to clarify and answer. From there, here's my selvage edge. Right here, it's got this kind of almost the little threads on the end, the little fringe that selvage often has. And what I actually did was tore each end, because when you tear fabric, it will be exactly on grain. If I thought my backing was super, super twisted, I honestly might not have done that, because remember I said earlier, you might not be able to ever achieve perfect square. But if you have enough of the backing, that can still be helpful, because it helps you to know where you are, right? And to gauge how off it is. In this case, my backing was not too bad. So here's the widest bit that I tore off. And at each end, you can see I've got a much narrower piece, right? So there was about 2.5 to 3 inches of wonkiness. And that's not honestly too bad. I was pretty happy with that. So I tore both ends, and now I've got a selvage on each side. So we're going to go ahead with our usual method of loading the selvage at the front. And our fabric does not have a right or a wrong side, so it doesn't really matter which way is up. It is muslin. And I'm just going to kind of spread it out because it is fairly big to sort of determine where I want to place it on my long arm rails. I don't like to start at one end and clamp it all in place and then find out, oh, I've run out of room at the other end. So if I spread out my backing, I kind of know where I'm at. And we did make sure we had plenty of backing because of that wonkiness. If you're going to lose 3 or 4 inches on one side or more, you need to know that you've got plenty of backing. So it looks absolutely huge on here, and honestly, the quilt is not quite that big. Let me just move my monitor out of the way here. Just get as much space as we can. Okay. So we're at the front edge. We've got a selvage edge here, so we know it is straight. That's the first edge I'm going to load. I'm using the red snappers. So there's a little core in the hem of my leader, and I'm snapping this top clamp onto it. And in other episodes, I talk more about these clamps. Today, we're just going to scoot right along. If you guys have questions about things that I'm talking about, if you could precede your question with QQ, that's really helpful to Mr. Producer to be able to search for them and pull them up and pop them on screen for me. So just 2 Q's in front of your question. If you only do 1 Q, then every time we say the word quilt, that comes up. So that's why the 2 Q's, in case you wondered. Okay, I've got my backing loaded on the front. Here's your big tip of the day. Moisture is your friend. You guys who've seen me loading before know that I seldom, almost never, iron a backing. I simply spritz it with water. What you might not know is that that spritzing is also helpful if your grain is distorted and stretched. We're going to use it in our favor. So I'm going to spritz all of this backing a little bit so it's a little bit moist. The fibers relax. And I'm going to manhandle it a little bit. Try not to spritz the camera here while I'm at it. So I've tossed the bulk of it over the long arm rails. And now I'm just going to pull it smooth on the back side. Get it all hanging down, walk along it, spray it all. So in relaxing the fibers, then we're going to be able to manipulate it a little bit to try and straighten the grain a little bit. And I did say, you know, I don't really have measurements or precision to offer you. This is just based on my knowledge of sewing over the years and working with fabric and knowing what I can make it do, how far I can manipulate it. But this moisture is really key. And I'm making it fairly moist. A whole separate consideration is if you've got backing that's navy blue or red, that might be an issue. If you spritz it wet with dye, this might not be a great answer for that. But for this muslin, which has no dye in it, it's a great choice. So now I'm going to start rolling my backing on. Which camera am I on, Dave? The side one? I'm going to start rolling my backing on, and I can see already looking at it, my edge, though I know it's on the straight of grain, is veering significantly left. So I am going to tug on the right side every so often to manipulate that roll. And I know I don't usually do that because it's going to make some wonky creases here. And then I'm going to roll back and forth a little bit. And again, because I've got moisture in it, that grain is going to get manipulated a little and is going to shift and become better. So here we go. So I'll roll a few inches, and then I'm going to tug on that whole backing and pull it my way toward the right. This is made a little extra fiddly today because the camera is in the way right here, but we'll get it. So some of the ways that I'm judging how well this is doing now is I'm watching this front rail in front of me because my roll is starting to form around it of fabric, and so I can judge whether it's still veering off to the left or whether I'm getting it pretty straight. And here, depending on your backing, you might have to make some decisions. You might not be able to get it fully straight, but at least you can get it straighter. I'm actually achieving a pretty good match. Of my 3 inches of wonkiness, I think I'll be able to manage at least 2 of them, maybe more. So again, this only works because I've applied moisture. If I did this with my quilt totally dry, I would almost be guaranteed to end up with creases. So the moisture is key because you're actually going to change how the grain is oriented in this fabric. You're actually going to stretch it into shape. If you were a garment sewer, lots of pattern makers will recommend straightening the grain of your fabric by folding it and then pulling on opposing corners. That's basically what we're doing. We're just doing it at the long arm rail. Okay. I think we're far enough. I might have even gone a little too far. I did. Okay, we have to back up just a touch. I rolled a little too far over my rails. Grabbing my red snappers, coming around to the back of the quilt. So I've just got enough of my backing now extending over my leader that I'll be able to clamp that all in place. Again, if you want to see more information about the leaders at any point or the red snappers, some other episodes have more details about that. Today is really about managing this grain line. Snap it all into place. Try not to breathe too heavy into the microphone. perfect. It's in place. And I'm happy to report my little roll that's on my, the bulk of my backing is rolled up here is almost perfectly straight. So it did really well. But here's what I would do if I was still seeing evidence that there's pull lines in the grain. This is what I would do. I would literally wind my backing the other way. And I'm also holding on the rail where it's releasing the backing so that there's a little bit of tension the whole time, and that too would help to manipulate that backing and stretch it into shape. But it actually did really well first time around. So we're just going to put it back at our starting position. Back we go. And we are in business. We're just talking about the camera a moment, you guys. Just give us just a moment here. Bear with us. So this part here, and it is going to keep. Okay, we're just shifting the close-up camera, you guys. Bear with us just a moment. I'll get me a sip of coffee while Mr. Producer does that. Good. Okay. Next step, batting. What we're using today is absolutely luxurious. I am loading 6-ounce bamboo batting, and this is by Winline is the brand. I wish we had Feel-O-Vision so you could just come and feel this. It is so soft and so gorgeous. It is the yummiest batting ever. It comes, gosh, I've got little threads. This doesn't happen to any of you guys, does it? Pick up threads from everywhere no matter how often you vacuum. My batting comes off the roll 60 inches wide. So this is 60 here, and there's a fold line along this edge. I cut it that way so it's long enough for my quilt, and I'm going to open it up, and then I'll have enough batting for the 2 quilts, right, that are going to be quilted end to end. So let's just open our batting up. And I've had some back and forth with myself over what's the right side up of this batting. And it is needle punched. I can see the needle holes, but I can sort of see them on both sides. So I've tried it both ways, and it seems to be working fine. So as far as I can tell, there's not a right side up. So that's always convenient. Okay. There's still a fold under there. Come on down. There's a big old piece of batting. So all I'm doing is laying it on top of my backing fabric and arranging it so that it's close to my leader at the top, relatively smooth and as flat as I can make it. And then the excess is just floating down on the floor in front of me. And you'll see as we go on, I'm going to float my quilt top as well. I find that the easiest and most efficient way for sure. So there's my batting nice and smooth. And now at last you get to see the quilt. Here it comes. There's our little quilt top. Isn't that pretty? So, as I said earlier, Marla, whose quilt this is, she took one ginormous quilt and actually cut it in half. So it's a bit long and not terribly wide. But the advantage of this now is Marla and her sister each get to have one. And we talked about what we want to quilt it with, what kind of threads we want to use, and we decided, you know, much like your eyebrows, you want sisters but not twins. So they're not going to be identical. So we're going to do different quilting designs and, in fact, different thread. Mr. Producer is laughing hysterically, but you guys know what I mean. You guys know what I mean. I know you do. The eyebrows. Yeah, they're sisters, not twins. That's how it works. So again, I'm just visually arranging my quilt so that the straight edge of it is even with my red snapper or my leader hem, whatever straight edge I've got up there. Getting it in place. On one side of the quilt, one side only, there was this, the diamonds were left whole and not trimmed straight. And we decided that for interest, because that's unique and individual, we're going to quilt that in. I'm going to quilt that shape in my basting along the edge, and Marla will bind it with that shape so that one end of her quilt will have this pretty little diamond angled shape on it. Now, I do have to keep in mind, because these are diamonds, there's a ton of bias throughout this quilt, right? So I'm being gentle in my smoothing because I could stretch this quite wonky. So it pays to watch the seam lines. Are they staying parallel to my rails, right? And not to overstretch it in any way. We should look at one more thing before we cover it up. The whole quilt was foundation pieced on other fabrics. So they vary, as you can see, right? The diamonds are different. But the stripy, scrappy bit on the front was foundation pieced on another piece of fabric. What that means as a quilter is my seam allowances are fairly bulky. So I need to be aware of that, and we're going to talk about that more when we get to the actual quilting. But that's one of the things that that's part of sort of assessing your quilt top. Like, what are the things that this quilt has? Well, this one has bias edges, and it has bulky seams. These are the things I need to know as a quilter, and when I'm prepared for it, I can put the proper foot on my machine. I can quilt at a speed that will accommodate the challenge of those bulky seams. I can pick a quilting design that will enable me to place my quilting on some of those bulky seams and quilt them down nice and flat. So all of that comes into play. And this is my note to myself so that I get the right quilt with the right thread. Green thread, 6482. Good deal. We're in business. Okay, do we have some questions before I start basting and I'll get me a sip of coffee in? And then we'll get going. Let me grab my coffee cup. And just so you know, I'm standing well away from the quilt so I don't, inadvertently slosh coffee on it. Gaynor, do you always load the backing on the top front rail and float the batting and top over it? Yes, I do, Gaynor. Now, that's not the only way to do it, right? And I've talked about this before. This idea of floating is not the only way, but it is my preferred way. It's fast. It's efficient. I've worked out a system where it's even quite accurate. So that all makes me happy. Janet, how do you feel about just washing that 108-inch wide backing and drying for about 10 minutes, then loading it on your frame? Wouldn't that help you deal with the wonkiness of it? It probably would. That would certainly be another option. So you'd be loading it slightly damp. Yep, probably would. And I've seen people do what I mentioned that dressmakers often do is lay out the fabric and literally stretch it and then leave it to dry. That would absolutely work too. It's just so huge. Most of us don't have space to do that on the floor unless it's folded in some way. I find it easiest to just do it right on the long arm rails and use them to do that work for me. Just my preference though. Shelley, where can I find the long red snappers like yours? When I purchased mine, I was bummed because they're only about 18 inches long. Well, Shelley, mine did come as a set with the long pieces in it. However, I guess it slows you down a little bit because you have to pick up a few more pieces, but I've actually considered cutting mine because then they could travel with me. So it's not a bad thing to have the shorter pieces, quite honestly. They work just as efficiently. So I have the 3-footers, they might even be 40 inches, and I have the 18-inch pieces, and I have some little ones like that. That's what came in my set. Mallory, you once mentioned a spray you use to get stubborn wrinkles out of the center of the backing fabric. I don't honestly have a specialty spray. I just use water. That's all I have in my spray bottle. And it seems to work just fine. Emily, have you tried the spirits bottle beauticians use? I haven't. Spritz, sorry. I haven't, although someone mentioned it to me the other day because I believe the difference is you squeeze once and it sprays for a period of time instead of having to spray, to squeeze it over and over again. I don't have any trouble with my hands, so this has not been an issue for me, but that might be a great tool for some people watching. Jan, love your show so much. I don't have room for a long arm, so I watch you instead. That's awesome. That is so awesome. Okay, I'll set my coffee down, guys, and we'll get started. Okay, Stacy, what do you charge per inch? Is that how it works? Love your videos. Generally, it does, Stacy. Most long arm quilters do charge per inch because that's a great way to keep the price exactly relative to the size of the quilt. Mine varies a little bit depending on how in-depth the quilting is. So if you want an exact quote, send me an email and we'll talk about that. Yeah, that's it? Okay. Often, you guys, and you will know this, often I just baste around the quilt, up the left, across the top, down the right, But today I'm going to pin a little bit because it has so many bias edges and there's so many places for it to easily get stretched and go wrong. I'm going to drop some pins in so that I'm sure to get it, to keep it aligned. So this will vary depending on your quilt. How stretched out is it? How stretchy is it? Yes, someone apparently is reminding me about magnets, telling Mr. Producer to remind me. The magnets come after the basting though, you guys. Clearly you watch me too much when you know what's coming next. No, there's never too much. But thanks for being such loyal fans, and thanks for reminding me, because sometimes I do get talking and forget these things. So I'm just dropping pins every 8 or 10 inches just to keep things from shifting. I've got that kind of check-in every 8 inches in that way. My little cup, by the way, with the little, like it's got a ring that holds up when I want to store it and has a lid and the pins fit totally inside it, but also slides down so I can grab my pins. This is by Purple Hobbies. After the show is over, I will put a link in the chat. I'd rather Mr. Producer didn't do it now because I'll give you my link on it. And then you might get a better deal. Anyway, these are very cool. And she cuts them on a 3D printer, which is very fun. Okay, that's a little side note. Now let's see, where are we at? Okay, well, you've got something else on the screen, Dave. Okay, apparently there's another comment that I've just got to read. Nancy, I was going to remind you to take your shoes off. You guys know me way too well. Way too well. Here's another thought. Are we on the close-up camera? I think that would be the best way at the moment. You see that I've got this is my diamond-shaped angled edge, right? What am I going to do with basting there? Clearly, I'm not basting a straight line. My choices are a couple. I could load my ruler plate and do a beautiful straight baste on it with a ruler, but also knowing that this basting line is never going to show, it's going to fall inside the binding, I'm just going to do it by eye. And Mr. Producer's talking to me. Sorry, you guys. I'm just going to do it by eye, and it's not going to be a thing of beauty, but it doesn't matter because it's going to hide in that basting line. So bear with me a second while I turn my camera off on the machine, and we'll see if the lighting gets a little bit better. Oh, not the camera. Sorry about that. Machine, light, off. Is that better? Okay, let's turn it on and just put it at a different setting. That's 50. That's as low as I can go. How does that look, you guys? Good? Okay. Back to stitching on the basting. Okay. So again, I'm just going to do this by guess and by gosh. All that's important to me is that I stay within the 1/4 inch seam allowance so that it will get hidden in the binding. So it's not apt to be super pretty, but it doesn't really matter. It's going to hold it in place, and that's what matters. And I'm kind of hanging on to the edge of the quilt. I don't know that you can see my left hand. When I'm pulling sideways like that, it sort of wants to pull the quilt in. And I could put my magnets in place, but I really prefer to do them after the basting is done. So my solution then was to just grip it a little bit with my hands and keep a little bit of tension on the edge of the quilt. I do not have my channel lock on, holding me in a perfectly horizontal line, but I am gauging my straight line by my red snappers. You guys won't be able to see it, but I can see the foot plate of my machine right against that red snapper, and so that's how I'm creating a straight line here. Because it is a bias edge, I'm just taking it slowly, and I'm either putting some tension on what's already stitched, or sometimes when I need more, I'm grasping the seam allowance and tugging on what's already been stitched to keep what's not yet stitched getting under that hopper foot, under the needle, and not letting it push out in front of me. And I just take my time on this, but because this is key. This is establishing the shape of my quilt, right? So I don't want to hurry too much. If I push this out in front of me, it's really going to mess up the shape, the straight edges of my quilt, and I don't want to do that. And right here, I just came across a seam allowance that's actually coming open a little bit. So my fix for that is I'm going to go back and forth across it a few times just to really anchor it in place. Here's another one. Hindsight being what it is, which is 2020, it might have been wise to take this to the sewing machine first and sew a nice little victory lap, a basting line around the outside. But I did not, frankly, notice those couple seams. There aren't very many that are coming undone. So I'm just anchoring them a little by stitching back and forth over them a bit. I'm using a 1/4 inch basting stitch. If your machine does not have a basting stitch, you can certainly just do this with your regular stitch length as well. Works equally well. And now down the right side, which is nice and straight. You see again, I've got that little fullness that wants to push out in front of the hopper foot, and I just need to tug on the bit that's already stitched to encourage it to go under the needle a little bit faster, and it manages all of that. And that's the beauty of having my pins. Every so often I've got that check-in point. I know I need to have that fullness all pulled in by the time I get to that pin. And that is exactly why I pinned, to help me with that sort of visual guide. Okay, now I'll run back along and pull all my pins out. And we're about ready to get quilting. Are there any more questions about the basting, you guys, before we launch into the quilting? Okay. So I am going to attach my tension clamps to the sides. Here's a tricky bit. When you have torn the edges, this particular brand of edge clamps can be hard to get on. Probably the other end is the better one for the camera. I'll show you a tip when I get to the other end that you can see a little more clearly. The clamps that I'm using are called E-edge clamps, and they're the same brand as my red snappers. It's the red snapper people that make them. What I love about them, in case you've got a different brand, or if you're looking for a set, what I like best is that they're long and they fill my whole throat space and put even tension on that whole edge of the quilt. So that's a factor that I really look for. Also, when they're closed, they're a very slim profile. That's another feature that I really like about them. So if you have another brand, or if you're looking for a brand and maybe can't find this one, those are the features that I love best. Okay, in my snapper, the channel where my fabric needs to go is very, very slim, less than 1/8 of an inch. So this is where I'm finding it to be a little tricky because I've torn that edge of fabric. It's a bit rolled up and a bit frayed. So I'm just using my pin. I slipped one end of my clamp over the fabric, and now I'm just running my pin along the fabric and that channel and just nudging it inside there. It takes a minute of time, but it's worth it. I don't want to proceed without having a clamp on this edge. I need that tension on the side edges. My other option, if I really couldn't get it in, would be to just use these clamps, right? And just clamp to the backing edge of my quilt. What I don't love about that is you just have pulling right where the clamp is and pulling right where the other clamp is, right? I love that even tension on the whole strip, but it's an option if you can't get your snapper on. There's always options. And I wait to put these end clamps on until I do have the basting done. What I like about that is now my tension that's on the sides is on all the layers. If I were to clamp just my backing first and then lay my quilt on, my backing would have a little tension and would be a little bit more stretched. So I like to do the basting all first and then put those side clamps on so the whole quilt has the same tension. And by the way, it's not a lot. I don't have a drum going on here. I've just got enough tension so that I'm not worried about the backing wrinkling up, just enough to pull it smooth and flat. Okay, we have a few questions. Okay, let's see them. All righty. Nancy, have you ever basted a whole quilt, then rolled it back to the start to quilt it? I have, Nancy. I don't love it. This may just be me. But when I have done that, and then I roll up all those layers, and then I unroll them as I'm quilting, I find that the quilt top, which is the outer edge of all those rolls, has in fact stretched a little bit because it's fabric, right? So the same thing we were doing with our grain of fabric and manipulating it this morning, it does that to the quilt top. It stretches it just a little bit. So that's been my experience. I have a really hard time then getting the quilt to lay flat. So I don't prefer to do it that way. Judy, would it have been easier to make a basting line through the middle of the quilt? I'm not sure why I would have, Judy. You mean like through to the backing too? I don't know why I would. I could. I'm going to put magnets in a moment along the front rail, and I could run a basting line on that front edge instead. Either of those would work, if that answers your question. Sewing Corner, I finally got some red snappers in the UK. Total game changer and saves so much time and no more blood loss. Isn't that the truth of it? Pins are brutal when you stick your finger into them backwards. Yeah. Do you charge per square inch or inch? It's per square inch. So you take, the length times the width equals square inches, and that's the charge. Okay, you guys, last step is our trusty little magnets. You've seen these before, but I'll show you again. These are just shop magnets, the kind you'd have in your garage for your tools or perhaps in your kitchen for your knives. This back bar is a heavy-duty magnet, and I run these all along the front rail because remember, I've basted left, top, and right, and now I'm basting this fourth side so that my whole top is absolutely stable and can't shift and move while I'm quilting. And this is why I like this floating method. My backing is loaded on that lower rail, and so all that's over this rail is one layer of backing, one layer of batting, and my quilt top, and it never gets thicker, so my magnets always hold. So as long as you've got a metallic rail that's magnetic, these work beautifully. They're very inexpensive. I get them at my local hardware store. Amazon has them if you can't find them elsewhere. Pretty sure there's a link in my description for them. So I just run these basically nose to tail across the whole front edge of the quilt. Everything's stable. We're ready to go. Can you believe it? We're going to start on the right-hand side just to be different. I should mention my thread. Hang on a sec. I'll have a look at it so I can tell you the color number. This is Wonderfill. Oh, where's the color number on here? Color number 6482. Maybe I'll go on the close-up camera. There we go. It is greenish, golden. I don't know how to describe it. Marla fell in love with this thread, and I like it too. It's just a little bit unexpected, but I think it will still blend in reasonably well. I love it. Love the color. It is 100% poly thread, which is what I love to use at my long arm. Very low lent, very strong thread, and it is 40 weight, I believe. Does not say that on the cone, but I'm pretty sure it is 40 weight. Wonderful. So that's all the thread details, and I've got the same thread in the top and in the bobbin. I am stitching to begin with my stitch regulator on, and I've got 10 stitches per inch as my kind of go-to size. So pull up the bobbin thread, and we are in business. And I have chosen a fairly simple swirly design for this quilt. As I mentioned earlier, there are some thick seams involved, and so I want to be able to place this quite precisely. So this is a great design for that because I can, as I go, I can decide where do I want this stitching to actually lie. And I'm going to do one other thing, you guys. I'm actually going to pause and break thread. I spoke earlier again about the thickness of the seam allowances, where these cross, where some of these triangle and multiple points meet like this. It's pretty bulky. It can happen that when my hopper foot is down, I will actually run into those bulky seams and it will want to push them out of the way. So I have a fix for that. I have a little cup clip that I can attach onto my foot, pardon me while I'm out of camera view. And it's got this, whoo, dropped it. It's got this curved bottom, which just skates right over. these bulky problem-ish sort of areas. So we're going to quickly put that on our presser foot, and it will just save the worry of getting over those bulky seam allowances. And again, these are all factors that you want to consider. I chose this swirly design number 1 because it allows me to place my stitches exactly where I want. But another advantage of it is I don't have to have precise vision of where my needle is landing. Like I'm not matching any points because it's kind of big and it's semi-translucent, but it does inhibit my vision, right? But my design is not that precise, so that's okay. But those are the kinds of things I think about when choosing a design or choosing what foot I'm going to have on my machine. So all I did was halt in the seam allowance, and now I'm back in the seam allowance and just starting again. And throughout this whole quilt, I'm going to keep my speed on the slow side because I am dealing with these bulky areas. And if I race over them, I'm apt to break my thread or even break a needle. So it pays to just take my time and it will all go well. Fingers crossed. And while I say that, I break thread. Look at that. Okay, the Susan method when you have a broken thread is, it does just happen sometimes. So I'm just going to rethread my needle and try again. If it happens a second time, then I'm going to pause and look a little deeper. Take some more, take some more steps to try and fix it. Get that needle threaded. Tricky. I am struggling, you guys. I'm really struggling with threading my needle. There we go. Okay. So now my bobbin thread did not break. So I want to pull up that bobbin thread. Well, I don't think it did. Okay, we do have an issue going on. So twice now I've rethreaded, and when I take the first stitch, it breaks that needle thread again. So now at this moment I'm exploring. I'm trying it again. I'm going to try and watch more closely. What is it that it's doing that's cutting my thread? Something is wrong, right? This is not normal. Something is wrong. Now we got to try and figure out what it is. Let's try this one more time. One stitch to pull up that bobbin thread. That time it worked. Okay, we'll proceed with caution. Get my trusty little seam ripper. So you can see right here my thread was shredding a little bit. I think you can see. And there's some skipped stitches, so I've got to back up to before that. And I like, if possible, to back up to a point. That always looks the best in terms of a splice. So we'll go ahead and back up a little further. And the good news is where the next point is way up here, and it is in a very printy piece of fabric, so that's a great choice. So I'm going to go all the way up there because then it won't show. And I can still see here where I am, it had already broken a fiber. Now I'm into the good stitches. But always when I'm rewinding like this, I'm paying attention to that. Like I need to get back to before there was any damage to the thread. So I'm back to good quality stitches before I do my splice. So here's my little corner. I know you won't be able to see it because it's on a little plaid. Just trust me, it's a nice little corner, a great place to do a splice. If you can't see it, no one else can either, right? Okay, so again, I still don't know for sure if I've resolved the problem, so I'm going to stitch slowly and carefully. See if we get on smoothly or if we need to look further for some thread issues. So I'm overlapping probably about 1/4 inch of my earlier stitching, doing some close and tight anchor stitches there, lock stitches. You see the beauty of these swirls though. I can very much judge as I'm stitching exactly where my stitches are landing and place them so I'm stitching down those bulky seam allowances. I could hear you guys in this last swirl, and I can see it now. There are a couple of skipped stitches. So again, we're going to take some remedial measures. So I'm going to do two things here. I'm going to rethread top and bottom, and I'm also going to put a new needle on because it seems to me that that needle is popping a little bit. I don't routinely change my needle for every quilt. I just try to be attuned. And as soon as I hear something like this where the needle's popping, I'm like, okay, that's probably something that's contributing to my poor stitch quality. Better change that needle out. And because I am working on these thick seam allowances, I am going to load it with a jeans needle. I don't know by sight all the designations of needles. You know how they have the little markings on the shank of them? So I'm not 100% sure what I have loaded in here. I think it's probably a universal because that's what I use the most. So we're going to go ahead and load a jeans needle because we are dealing with bulky fabrics today. Bulky seam allowances at least. Because remember, underneath all these scrappy diamonds, there's a foundation fabric as well. So everything has got that extra layer. Okay, we're back at a corner. I like to drop my blue seam ripper right where my splice is going to be so that even if I move my machine around, I can find where I was. So let's start by rethreading the bobbin just to make sure. You probably can't see this all that well, but I'll tell you what I'm doing as I do it. I've just rethreaded the bobbin and reseated it just to double check. I'm going to move way down to the other end of the quilt just because that's where my needles are, and go ahead and change my needle, and you can probably see a little better down there too in case you're interested in what I'm doing. Let's find us a jeans needle and a screwdriver. I don't think I have to take my foot off to do this.
We're going crazy.
I know you've heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it again. One of the things that I love about my Bernina machine is that it uses regular sewing machine needles. So I have these options. If I want to try a jeans needle or a top stitch needle or whatever the case may be, not only do I have them on hand because I've got them for my sewing machine, but they're certainly easy to come by. So we've loaded a jeans needle on. Do you know what? We're going to take a second, rethread that top thread too, just to be on the safe side while we're pausing anyway. So I'll just start right from my spool and rethread it. Just in case anything, like sometimes with those thread breaks, because they often happen with a jerk, you know, your thread might have come unseated from the tension discs or something like that. So a rethread is just a good idea. It's 30 seconds well spent. I'm watching Mr. Producer out of the corner of my eye. I think he's playing with some new camera angles. And this is why I dropped the blue seam ripper. Otherwise, how would I find where I was? I've got a, is there a cable catching back there? I'm feeling pull. All right, right here. Again, a few lock stitches just to anchor that new thread in place, overlapping a little bit. I'm just taking a minute to look and kind of decide where I'm going next before I start stitching. Here we go. I can definitely feel the thickness in terms of like the quilt top is almost moving as I'm stitching over it. So I'm definitely going to take my time with this and do it slowly and with ease because that thickness is definitely a factor today. So far, we seem to be getting good stitches. Knock on wood. So maybe that new needle was the trick. I still hear it popping a little bit, but I seriously think that that is just the thickness that we're working with. It's just having to work a little bit to pierce all these layers. And so that's why I'm going slower, just to give it the best possible chance. The needle has to actually flex with each and every stitch because you're moving as it's passing in and through the fabric. And so that's why slowing down helps. It gives that needle an opportunity to cleanly pierce the fabric and come back up. There are places, by the way, I don't know that you can really see it. Let me see if I can get my hopper foot up. There are places where there's actually a pleat in the seam and the fabric. This is something that you find quite often in vintage quilts. And honestly, I just let it be. That's just part of the charm, part of the process. I'm not going to worry about it. Very thick right there. Slow and easy does it. And we have a broken thread again. So again, maybe I'll rethread from the top again. That just seems to be wisdom. Okay, all the way from the top. From the top. Isn't that what they say for the film in a movie? That's what we're doing, isn't it? So if you're just chiming in, by the way, this is a live stream. You may be watching a replay, but it's recorded during a live stream of Quilting a Project. And we call it live and unscripted for that reason. Nothing is edited out. So this bit you're seeing right now with the broken threads and the shredding, that sometimes happens when you're working on a quilt. And this can be the challenge as a long armor, to try and figure out why it's happening and to diagnose the problem. So I am working on a quilt that has a lot of bulk. Underneath these scrappy diamonds, they were all sewn onto yet another layer of fabric. So some of these seams are super, super bulky. And sometimes when that happens, when your needle passes in and out, the thread shreds as you're doing it. So I'm just playing it by ear at the moment. I've rethreaded. I've put on a jeans needle, which is a little thicker, a little more robust. I'm going to try one more time with this, and then I may try another needle that's got a longer eye and a longer scarf, and that would be a top stitch needle. I'm just trying things. I do not know what the perfect answer is. I'm just going to try things and see if I can get to the bottom of it and get a better result. Because it will take a very long time to finish a quilt if I'm having to slice my thread every 20 inches, won't it? So again, I'm just overlapping 3 or 4 stitches, less than 1/4 of an inch probably, doing a few really closely spaced stitches to lock that new thread tail in place, and off I go. And I usually pause for a moment and then clip my thread tails. This is a busy quilt, so you won't see them later. It's kind of, I feel like you got to clip them while you go. So move all my little tools here. Hopefully we're done with those, right? There you can see a nice swirl while I'm on the yellow. And we broke again. Okay. So now when that happens a couple times, then I'm like, okay, time to try something different. So this time it's going to be a different type of needle. So what I have in right now is a jeans needle, and I'm just going to walk down to my needle container, and I'm off camera, sorry. And I'm going to instead choose a top stitch needle. The difference with the top stitch needle is that it's got a considerably longer eye and a longer scarf on the needle, which affects how it's piercing the fabric and how it's holding the thread while it does that. So we're going to change that little factor and see if that is the ticket. And by the way, little side tip, I have one of those, you know, the little red tomato pin cushions that have the strawberry dangle off of them. I have one for my needles, and I actually wrote on it like what type of needle. So I've got an area for jeans needles, one of those wedges, and another wedge for top stitch needles, so that I can use this again, because it's a brand new needle, and yet I hate to put it back in my new box. Do you know what I mean? So that's a way that I can keep track of my needles a little bit. All right. Let's give this a whirl, you guys. Send good thoughts. Mr. Producer is saying there's lots of comments. So let's go this way. I will get this backed up to a good starting point, and then I'll take a moment too. And, you know, sometimes just taking a moment is helpful. I'll get me a sip of my magic elixir, and we'll take a few questions and comments. Maybe some of you guys have a great tip or thing that you've tried. Yeah, maybe you do. So again, I'm just backing up to a corner. I like to do my splices at a point. Difficult to make a nice smooth splice on a curve. So a point is good. Over a seam allowance is good. That helps to anchor it too when those lock stitches fall in a seam allowance. So again, I'll drop my blue seam ripper right there where my splice is so I can find it when I come back. Let's get a cup of coffee and let's chat. All righty. Bella, are you extra dressed up today? Just a little levity, such patience. I mean, I don't think so. It really is just kind of a sweatshirty thing, but it does have this pretty collar. So, you know. Dawn, I love how calm you remain, because by the third one and by in one row, me and my machine are in a fight. You know, I've been there, Dawn. I absolutely have. But I have learned over time, there is no magic fix other than try this, try that, try that, try that, try that. And eventually, usually, something breaks through. Sometimes I do just have to go away and take a nap or leave it overnight. Nancy, looks like lots of different types of fabrics too. Good point, Nancy. There absolutely is. This is so scrappy. And, you know, I mentioned in my newsletter, if you're on my newsletter when I was describing it last night, you know, I like to imagine when I'm quilting these, the little boys' shorts and shirts and PJs and, you know, maybe dad's dress shirts and grandma's aprons or what, all those scraps are represented here. So a ton of stories, which makes a quilt like this very fun to work on, but does indeed add to the challenge. That needle is piercing through who knows what. Some of them are kind of canvasy. There's lots of cottons. It looks kind of 70s-ish vintage. Some of them are kind of, what's the one that's raised? Damask. Some of them are like that. Yeah, all kinds of things. So that is adding. Of course it is. Another factor. Nita, look for lint by your tension discs too. Sometimes that breaks the threads for me. That's a really great point, Nita. Actually, yesterday I spent a fair bit of time kind of deep cleaning my machine. I have some little, they're kind of shaped like Q-tips, like cotton ball sticks, but for a machine, so they don't have cotton like lint on them. So I had those, and I had my bobbin casing open, and I was seriously cleaning in there, and there was a fair bit of lint buildup. So that's a good point. If you're having this trouble with skipped stitches, do a deep clean. And, you know, if it comes down to it, if I can't get to the bottom of this while we're on air, that's what I would do is, you know, pull all the thread out, floss all the thread discs, deep clean, because that sometimes is where the problem lies. So that will fall in my list of things to try. Nancy, it started when you put the new foot on. I wonder if it's the foot not on properly. That's a great point, Nancy. I'll give that a try. We'll take that off and reseat it and see if that helps. Good point. Debbie, are you using the same thread in top and bobbin? Yes, I do have the same thread in top and bobbin. I thought that was one factor that I could make as smooth as possible and not try to mess with different tensions and different weights, right? Having them the same was the least challenging.
So now we're on a few more for basting.
Okay, now we're back to some basting questions. Nita, how do you keep the backing flat and warping inward when basting? I'm not sure I follow, Nita. Do you mean this front edge to keep it from warping, or just from moving when I'm basting it? When I'm basting it, I'm just managing it with my other hand, and with my experience of doing hundreds of quilts, others might choose to pin it more often even than I did this morning in place to keep it flat. I hope that's answering your question. The sewing corner. How do you deal with puddling in the center halfway through a quilt? I don't typically have that happen. I do manage the fullness of my quilt, especially if the quilt is unevenly shaped and I know that going into it. One end is wider, or the borders are fuller, or the center is fuller. And I manage it with every pass of the quilt rather than ever letting it add up and accumulate to an insurmountable problem. And by the way, I don't know that Mr. Producer has this link, but on all my social media this week, I was promoting a little ebook that I just put out about that process of how to manage that and how to plan for it and cope with it at each pass. And I think the comment was flat. So on any of my social media posts, you'll see that. Comment flat for the little ebook. So you might want to read that. See if that helps. Janice might need to add a little something to the coffee. It's very possible. You know, if it helps.
Okay, I'm getting back. We're getting a lot of here. So,
More questions are coming. Just takes a moment to sort. Janice, still using the top stitch needle? I do have the top stitch needle in now. Yes. I don't know when you put this question up, but that is what's on it now. Janice, how are you liking Wonderfill compared to Isacord? Does it have a way to hold the thread tail? I find that helpful. I do not think the cones have a way to hold the thread tail, and I'm sad about that, but a rubber band around the cone does help with that too. Jan, how do you decide what pattern to quilt? Do you rehearse patterns with drawings or plastic? Do you know, Jan, I have often done that in the past. You guys have seen me with my plexiglass board that I lay on top. Certainly in the past, I have done that more. At this point, I've quilted most designs in my repertoire many times, so I just kind of mentally run through them. What's a good suitable design for this quilt? But I tend to ask myself questions. Who's the quilt for, right? It's for a lady my age. So I don't want something frivolous like maybe flames, right? It's a bit of a traditional quilt. So that initially kind of guides me toward what style I want to quilt on it. And then too, as I mentioned, because I'm dealing with these bulky seams, I chose something that would, the curviness would take up any little excess ripples of fabric and would allow me to place my stitches on those bulky seams. I can kind of manipulate them. So that's kind of how I arrived at the swirls. Laura's asking what determines your stitch per inch choices. 10 is kind of my go-to, Laura. I use that on almost all of my edge-to-edge quilting. The only time it changes is I go finer if I'm quilting something really tiny, like tiny bubbles, you know, and then it almost gets hexagonal shaped if you've got a longer stitch length. And so then I might go to 12 or 14 per inch to do tiny, tiny details. But 10 is a very good average go-to for me. Some quilters prefer a bigger stitch. It looks a little more like hand stitching, so they might go for 8 or 7. Personal preference. Shell, where do you get the puff clip for your foot? Oh, the cup clip. It is Bernina branded. So on the Bernina machine, it's an option that you can add to your foot. Most machine brands will have something. It'll be a spoon foot or a cup foot or even some of the couching feet. So if you're talking Bernina, their couching foot also has that cup shape, and you could use that one if you don't have this clip. Just something that's got that curved shape is really, really helpful. Gainer, when you unpick, how do you make sure you don't have any bobbin thread hanging down on the back? Super question. I hang on to the top thread and I pull the bobbin thread is what I'm pulling with my seam ripper. So it's coming up with every stitch as I'm undoing. That's how I make sure. Wendy, what does reseat mean? I think reseat was the word I used, and it's just like when I was seating the needle in its holder or placing the hopper foot on Maybe there's a better word, but that's the one that came to mind. Repositioning and reattaching. Reseat was what I meant there. Apparently the questions are pouring in. Mr. Producer's trying to keep up. Angie, I wonder whether vintage fabrics are too fragile for long arming. Do you find that to be an issue at all? I'm concerned about that with the one I need to work on. Do you know, Angie, I think if this was super heritage and super fine fabrics and I was trying to create an heirloom, I would consider that. But most of the vintage quilts that come across my long arm rails are, what's the word? They're the same. They were intended for couch and family use, and they're not necessarily intended to be an everlasting heirloom, right? So in many cases, I feel like the long arming is holding them together. This one happens to be machine sewn, but quite a few of the ones I do are hand stitched together. And some of those stitches are loose and inexpert. And sometimes I feel like the long arm quilting is holding it together. So you be the judge of that. I don't know that the two, you know, you're very much mixing a modern technique with an older one if you've got a hand-stitched quilt and you're machine quilting it. And so it might be losing some of its heirloom quality. Like if you are fixing a piece of heirloom furniture, it's no longer an original, right? So think about that. But for my purposes, for this purpose, Marla just wants this quilt to remember the maker by, right? We just want to get it done and get it for her to be able to use it. So that's keeping the purpose in mind helps with that decision. Okay, apparently there are a number of questions related to this. We're getting a sampler. Here you go, Kim. Breaks were happening once before with Wonderfill thread. I wonder if swapping to Isocord as you did before might make the difference. It's an interesting thought, Kim, and I have explored that over the last few weeks. I've gone back and forth. But honestly, I've had similar issues with both. It feels like whenever it's needle, fabric, whatever the thing is, lint, it's happening with both threads. Because I did question that too. Is it a thread difference? Wonderfill and Isocord are the only two polys I have on hand. I might go get me a glide spool too and just see, but I have not seen there to be an appreciable difference there so far. But thanks for pointing that out. It is a consideration. Grant is asking what size are the needles. Good question. Let me go look, Grant, and I will let you know. My top stitch needle is 90-14, which is a pretty neutral size. Not terribly heavy, not terribly fine. Older fabrics are coarser. Any feed bags or feed sacks, you know, there very well could be. I can't tell by looking. I'm not enough of an expert. Some of these prints certainly look like they could be. Is there a rough edge on your machine foot? Again, not that I have seen, but I will change it out and reapply it, and I'll have a good feel while I'm in there. I may put a different foot on just for cuz. Judy, have you used bamboo in past quilts? Could that be the culprit? I have used bamboo. I don't think that is the culprit. I was actually quilting with it yesterday with no troubles at all. Karen, do you charge extra when a client quilt has potential frustration factor, like higher potential for problems? Not typically, Karen. I try to make my charge be, you know, to cover a few eventualities, because sometimes things go wrong and you have to undo. So I kind of have a factor of time that I have to spend either talking with the client or planning the design or dealing with challenges. Each quilt tends to have something. So no, I don't honestly put a surcharge on for that. It's just part of the process.
This is the lady earlier who was asking the basting.
Okay. Okay, apparently this relates to an earlier question, Nita. When I base the quilt, even following with my fingertip, the fabric tends to move toward the center. Making it not lay flat. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. So, Nita, that's what I manage by putting pressure on the part I've already stitched to pull the other under more quickly. If that's not doing it for you, then I would just drop in a bunch more pins till you get enough that it holds it. You can get from one pin to the next without it pushing the fabric out of place or making any ripples for you. That's where I'd start. Okay, that's all the questions. So here's what we're going to do, guys. We're going to start by taking the foot off and the cup clip off. I'm just debating if I should try a whole other foot. I just don't think I have a better choice. I am able to move to the other end, then you guys can see what I'm doing. So the cup clip snaps on to my regular foot, and I'm feeling it. There's nothing rough on there. There's nothing rough on my cup clip. Just being really sure. They do kind of have to line up with each other because there is a slit for the thread. So let's make really sure we're getting that straight. We'll attach it again. We'll do a bit more stitching. If this does not work, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. How's that? I just don't really have another foot that will skate over top. All my other feet are smaller and finer, and I don't think will be an improvement. We're going to give this a whirl. If nothing else, you guys got some tips on using 108-inch wide backing today, right? You get to see me quilt all the time. And she's broken again. So that's not the answer. Okay. What shall we do?
You have a comment from Grant. Do you want to see it?
Sure. Apparently there's another comment with maybe a suggestion in it. Let's see what Grant's got to say. Can you lower top tension a bit to see if that helps with thread breaks? I absolutely can, Grant, and I'll give that a whirl, although I don't think that will give me good tension on the back. So I'm hesitant to try that. What I am going to do is mess around a little bit with the height of my hopper foot. So watch this. Can you see it raising when I'm turning this brass dial and lowering when I turn it the other way? That does affect stitch formation, and I usually keep it as low as possible because it keeps the quilt layers as low and flat as possible. But since we've tried everything else, let's try raising that a little bit and see what happens. So here again, I'm pulling on the top thread. I think it was Grant that was asking this, and it's the bobbin thread that I'm unpicking, if you will. So it's all at the top. Other than that very initial part where I cut it and I just see the little strand there and I'll pull it off. Okay, let me see. I'm going to lower this all the way down to the bottom so I kind of know where I'm at. So I'm down as low as it will go. And now I'll raise it up a little bit. I'm going to raise it to the top and see how many turns there is and get an idea of how far I can go. A lot. Okay, we're going to go for about the middle. So all the way to the bottom again and up a few turns. Let's just see. Can't hurt, might help. Worst it can do is break the thread, right? We already know how to deal with that. Mr. Producer's laughing at me. Oh, we've got a thick one. And it's not broken, but it is skipping. Hard to know if that's just the thickness or what. But you guys, I think at this point, we're going to call it on our live streaming of this. I hate to do this because I like to show you guys the solutions. But I simply don't know what to try next, short of going and doing a really deep clean again. So including not only my bobbin area, but my tension discs, all of my thread guides, just to make sure there's no burrs happening. And I may even, on one corner of this, maybe on a seam allowance, try a different thread and just see. Every so often, you get a spool of thread that's a bit questionable. So who knows? And I'm just going to try these things one by one. But are we in agreement, Mr. Producer? I think that... Okay. One moment while we confer. Okay, here's the scoop, you guys. Shall we put me on camera? Because I do want to share with you the reality of this as best I can, but you can't really watch me cleaning all my discs and so forth. Here's what we're going to try. We're going to go ahead and go off air, and I'm going to spend some time cleaning and see if I can get to a solution. And if you're interested in watching more of this, keep an eye on the YouTube channel today or have the bell on so you get notifications. And if we can figure this out, I'll come back on air again later today. And so you'll see it scheduled. We'll give you like an hour maybe of heads up notice so that you have some time to see it coming if you want to tune back in and see more of this. I do apologize. This is sometimes how it goes. And I don't like to edit out the difficulties, but you've seen me trying the various solutions. So I hope that is helpful. And I'll let you know what I'm going to do off air, which is initially to do a massive clean and check of all the places that the thread is flowing, every thread guide, every tension disc, the foot, and I'm just going to buff and polish and clean all of those things and see if we can get to the bottom of this. I may try a different spool and I may try a different bobbin, like it will probably be the same color, just literally a fresh one. That's only happened that I can recall once in the hundreds and hundreds of quilts that I've done that I had one spool that constantly broke, so I don't think it is that. But, you know, you got to try everything, right? So appreciate you guys' patience. This is our reality show, right? So, okay, hang on. Bear with me a second, you guys. So apparently there are a few of you that are saying, we want to watch you deep clean. So I'm just thinking, I'm really thinking on air here. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. We'll just leave the music on and I'll just come in and out of camera. I don't know that I'll talk all the way through it because I need to be thinking and paying attention, right? But if you want to watch me doing that and trying to figure out that process, I'm totally fine with that. We'll leave the bigger overhead camera on. Right, but I'm going to be moving the machine around. So I think we'll probably leave the overhead one on. But sure, you guys are welcome to watch. I'll leave the music on and make of it what you will. And if I find a solution, great. We'll all celebrate together, right? Okay, let's do that then. Sounds good. Sure. If there are some suggestions, let's read them over. This is always helpful. It's one of my favorite parts, honestly, of coming on air with you guys. Some of you have quilted as much or more as I have, and so it's beneficial to get everyone's experience in here. We're just scrolling through them. Lori, Wonderfield comes in 40 and 50 weight. The weight could be the problem considering the thickness of the block fabrics. Okay, Lori, thanks for that. I'll pay attention to that and I'll check that out and figure out for sure which one I've got. Donna, could the muslin backing be the problem? Often muslins are a coarser weave. You know, that is an interesting thought, Donna, and I would say this is a little bit coarser weave. I don't know how I can change it, although if this problem keeps persisting, it may be that I'll have to undo it and choose another one. That'll be low down in my list of things to try, but it's a possibility. It is. Have you ever loosened both tensions and just running looser overall? Good point. I may give that a try. Good point. I'm taking mental notes here. I'll give that one a try. Debbie, try 100 needle. So that's what the jeans needle was. So I have tried that already. Although I could try it in a different type of needle, I guess. Try sewer's aid on the thread. Okay, another good point. I've got that and I can try it. All right. I'm betting on thread. We're starting a little betting pool here now. Lengthen the stitch. Okay, not a bad idea. Yep. All right. So let's do a couple of these, right? I don't think that lengthening the stitch length is going to fix it, but it might lessen the incidences of it. So let's try that. I'm only going to put it at 9 because I don't want there to be a massive difference between. I'm going to get a thread conditioner and put that on. Let's start there. I'm not sure what brand this is, but it is a silicone thread treatment. So on my machine, I've got this little tiny white pad here. That's what it's going to be dropped into. And we'll condition the thread in that way.
You have recommended a different bobbin.
So we'll put a drop of the silicone in there. That's step 1. Let's try and figure out this thread. Wonderfill. 100% embroidery. 5,000 meters. Mr. Producer, do you want to just look it up online? It's the Polyfast thread and see what weight it is. Wonderfill Polyfast. Actually, look up Wonderful PES embroidery because that's what it says on this label. As far as I can see, it does not say a weight on the cone. Some of my cones do say, but this one doesn't. Okay, the other thing I'm going to do, and I think one of you suggested this, is just put a different bobbin in. Same thread, same winding process, just a new bobbin. And I know I am getting low down in the bobbin, so that might be the ticket. We're pretty confident the thread is 40 weight. Someone is asking what is Sewer's Aid. I would say Sewer's Aid is a brand, but what it is a silicone that you drop into a little kind of a cotton pad, and your thread runs over it into the machine, and it's just like a treatment for your thread. Can make it smoother. Sometimes when you have specialty threads, that's when you'd use it. It just helps it to run more smoothly through the machine. And of course, that's what we're looking for today, right? Any aid we can find to help it run through the machine. Before I do any more things, I'm going to go back and stitch a little more. Now that I have a new bobbin, I have not yet changed the tension, top or bottom. I like to not change too many things all at once, right? So I'm going to take a minute and try out some of these things I've done and see if they're the answer. So basically, I've put a new bobbin on and I've put a thread treatment drop, and that's all I've changed so far. Just going to take me a moment now to undo and get back to a good, neat stitch. Of course, it broke right over a seam allowance here, so it is like anchored really, really nicely. So we know the stitches are holding.
Hi for Mom and Pop, they're watching your pain.
Oh, Mr. Producer says Mom and Pop are watching my pain. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the support. I truly do not mind showing you guys this. I don't want to bore you with it being long and laborious, but this is the reality some days. Fortunately, not very many days. But this is sometimes the reality. And a quilt like this is a bit of a culprit because there are so many unusual factors here that are a bit out of the norm. All right. Need to rethread the top. So again, if you have a Bernina, I am now going through, there are 2 hooks. Where are we on camera, hon?
You're on the overhead, but I don't know.
Well, here in my threading area, there are two silver hooks with the little silicone holding pad in between them. Usually I just run my thread through one hook, but because I've got that silicone treatment, I'm going to actually run it through both hooks so that the thread runs right over that little pad with every stitch. All right. Come on, little Stella. You know you wanna. Okay, here we go. Nope, that is not it.
Did you lower your foot again? I think before I might have been lower your foot.
So I've still got the foot raised. I do not feel like that is being a help. So I think I'm going to lower that puppy right down again. It's generally been my experience that lower is better unless you're actually bumping into seam allowances. So I was trying it as a kind of perhaps, but I'm going to go back to my low position because I do think that is better in general. So here we go. Lower it all the way down. Good. I see that my thread further up here is where it was shredded. but I can't tell if that happened while I was stitching or coming through the machine. I'm just kind of keeping a weather eye out for that. Because if it's always happening way above my stitching area, then it's something else other than stitch formation. Does that make sense? But I just don't know that yet. The yank on it when it breaks can shred it. And that doesn't really tell you where it's happening. Come on, little Stella. Well, I got around that one. I see one stitch that skipped, so I am going to drop a pin in that and come back and fix that a little later. But let's just see. This is not bad. Let's see how far we can get. It's not perfect, but it's not awful. And also I realized my silicone treatment actually took some stitching to get that down to the needle. If that makes sense. So it might be that that's just coming into play now. Nope, there we go again. Well, say. Okay, next step is thorough clean. I think that's got to be next. Okay, I'm going to step out of camera and find me a couple of tools and be right back. Whoops. I'd rather not. We're just talking about whether or not we could mount a camera closer, but I don't think we're going to. Just makes it more difficult for me. Here's the little cleaners I was talking about. And I was given these as a kind of a door prize, so I can't even tell you what brand they are, but I'm positive that sewing machine supply places would have them. Can you see how they're kind of 4 inches long like a Q-tip, and they've got this little cotton ball on the end? They are very nice for, I am still here. I don't know that I'm going to be in the close camera, Dave. I'm going to be in all the other places. Oh, okay. Did you guys see it? I can't see the camera. There we go. We're just talking here, you guys, about the best way that we can let you guys see. I think it's better if I just say what I'm doing, Dave, because it's mostly right toward me anyways. So I'm just going to kind of tell you guys what I'm doing as I do it. Essentially, I'm just looking at the path of my thread, and I'm cleaning everything and flossing everything. And by flossing, I mean I've got my thread long tail hung. You can probably see me doing that, right? And I'm moving it around in all these hooks and running up and down and saying, is there any little bit of resistance, like there might be a little burr on there somewhere? Honestly, I have never found that to be true on one of my machines, but you gotta, what's the word I'm saying? You gotta try for it. You've got to rule things out. That's what I was trying to get to. So I'm kind of going to do that at every place where my thread flows through. And I'm moving the thread as much as I can so that even if it's shifting a little bit in its progress, I'm going to find out if there's any area where there's any kind of resistance. And now I'm over by my tension discs, which on a Bernina, if I have the hopper foot up, they're kind of loose and open. So that's how I've got them right now, so that I can feed my tiny little cleaning tip in there and buff that a little bit and see if there's any lint buildup in there. And there is a tiny bit. I don't feel like that was likely an issue, but there is a tiny bit of lint, so we'll get it out. Even my take-up lever, I'm just kind of looking through that. Is there any obstruction in there? Now I'm going to thread through it, and again, floss. Every area where my thread passes, I'm doing this little floss business. I'm looking at my intermittent tension spring, which is the little tiny spring that your thread goes through before the take-up lever. Every machine will have this somewhere. Is that spring still flexing and giving and looking like it ought to? That's what kind of evens out the flow of your thread to keep it from bobbing and jerking, that little spring. So it's a very, very, very important piece. I'm flossing everything and not having any difficulty at all. But again, we're ruling it out. We're ruling out the things. So a few of you are asking if it's possible that it's the muslin. And I have to say that is a possibility. And if that's what it is, clearly all these things I'm trying are not going to be the fix, right? But again, I'm still going to rule out absolutely as many as I can. And if I still can't get it to go, then I am going to consider that. I've really not quilted that far yet. I will seriously consider taking it off, undoing the muslin, and using something else for a backing and seeing if that is indeed the issue. I'd be kind of surprised, but I do have to keep an open mind. But I have quilted quite a few quilts with like a vintage sheet, like a 70s type sheet, which is also a coarser weave, and had no trouble at all. So this muslin did not feel unduly coarse to me. It does not feel like a quilting cotton exactly, but it did not feel rough or poor quality to me in any way. So I'd be surprised if that was the thing, but I have to keep an open mind. Apparently, a few of you are asking about the batting. I'm pretty confident in that one. For one thing, because I've been using a bunch of it this last week to quilt. And for another, it is top-notch quality batting. I don't think that is the issue. I really don't. Even, like, I did a whole quilt last night in the evening, and it was the bamboo batting, and I had no trouble at all. Too bad that's not the one we were doing today, right? I seem to have a knack for picking problem quilts. And there's a certain amount of reason to that, you guys. I choose quilts that I think have features of interest or challenges that would be helpful to you. But the downside of that is I end up with problem quilts, right, on these live and unscripted shows. That's just the nature of it.
Here's a recommendation is to do a test on the batting and the muslin and the quilt top.
Okay, someone is recommending, and it's a good idea, do a little bit of quilting that's on the batting and the muslin. And here's what I'll do is I'll just run around the corner and grab a tiny scrap of fabric to put on there. That will give the best recreation. Let's see. Hang on, you guys. Here's a little scrap that I trimmed off a quilt yesterday. Is there more room on the other end? No, there's not. It's about this. Oh, I guess where the diamonds are. You're right. Okay, let's scooch to the other end. Then you can perhaps see it a little better too. These are out of my scrap bins, by the way. A number of friends that I quilt for let me keep a trim from one end of a quilt. And so I keep these in my scrap bins, and I do quite a few scrappy, strippy quilts with them. And I love having all this selection. I've just got to be sure to not quilt on the quilt. This will certainly let us know if those bulky seam allowances are the culprit. We're not having any issues here. Interesting. So this tells us that it is our quilt in some way, whether it's fabric content, bulkiness. I am truly puzzled. So a couple of people are suggesting the isocord thread. The thing is, if I do that, I don't have an identical color, so then I still have to undo all that I've done so far. Again, I don't think that is the issue. I don't. They behave so similarly in my machine. I think, though, for today's purposes, I think we've got to call a halt to our live stream. Like, I really do. I don't know what more to try. Sure, like I might put on a new thread and try it, but then if that's the case, I'm going to have to stop and undo what I've already quilted before I go further. Like I might try 1 or 2 swirls, and if it works, then I'll be undoing that. So I think what I'm going to do is call a halt to today's live stream. If I find a solution, we'll come back on in a couple of hours' time. If I don't find a solution immediately today, I'll come back to the description of this episode and let you know. I'll go in there and type some of the things that I tried and let you know what the eventual answer or save was. I've got to get the quilt done, right? So in some way, I'm going to find a way to get it done, whether it's a different quilting design or an altogether different type of thread. I'm not really sure what that will come to be, but I can type that back in the description. So at least for those of you who've been so helpful with your hints and who clearly want to know all these solutions too, you can come back and read about what I last did. I think that's the best solution for the moment. So again, oh, apparently there's a question coming in. Yes.
Well, I just want to know, you did that after your cleaning.
So the question was, have I quilted since I did my cleaning? Did I try quilting since I did my cleaning? Okay, well, let's do that for half a second.
Sorry. I know you want to get off air.
This is about the most unorganized one you've ever seen, isn't it? I don't feel like that little cleaning did the trick, but what the hey, we'll give it a try. No, it's still skipping. It's not breaking, but I'm getting enough skip stitches that I can't leave the quilting that way. So I do think we'll leave it at that. At some point, I just have to make a decision, and that's the decision I'm making. We're going to go off air for now, and I'll see if I can find a good solution, and I'll share it with you for sure. So a brief little recap. Today's Live and Unscripted was very unscripted and very live. But these episodes, which we air 2 Fridays a month, generally are one long arming project from beginning to end. And the kind of point of them is to invite you into my studio and say, this is what it looks like in real time, even with the oopses and the things that go wrong. And it often is a quilt that's got some unique features. So often I do on air have problems because I'm dealing with these unique factors that figure into it. So for today's purposes, this vintage quilt has mixed fabrics, thick seams, foundation fabric on behind it, so it is quite bulky, and a muslin 108-inch wide backing. So what did show up well in this episode is talking about that wide backing and dealing with wonkiness or off grain quality and how I work with that at the long arm to even it out and square it up and get a better result on your quilt back. So that showed up well. And I'm having trouble, just consistent, ongoing trouble with breaking and shredding thread. So we've worked through things like rethreading, different needle, fresh bobbin, cleaning, oiling, etc. And I'm going to go ahead and go off air and keep pursuing this, maybe try some different sizes of needles, both larger and smaller, see if that's the key. Perhaps try a different foot than I've got on, perhaps try an altogether different thread. And in the description, I'll let you know what my success story was. And if I get a handle on it today, then we'll reschedule a live for later today and we'll come back on air again. And so you can see what the results were and hopefully see actually some of the quilting. So thanks very much for joining me. As always, it's a pleasure to spend part of my day quilting with you, and I hope to see you next time.